My president doesn't even know I am down here, said John Lewis.
The start of racial equality in transportation began with one black man, Tom Gaither, and one white man, Gordon Carvey. These two men were the Secretaries of Congress of Racial Equality. The Freedom Riders were started by the Congress of Racial Equality in 1961. It was started to encourage protesting the segregated businesses of the southern states. There was a lot of hope for the Freedom Riders to succeed, since the previous year's sit-in was a great achievement. An inspiration was the Bowdoin v. Virginia Supreme Court judgment that banned segregation in trains and buses. The Corps began planning their first Freedom Ride because of the motivation of the journey of reconciliation.
The goal of the rides was to compel Kennedy administration to enforce Supreme Court ruling that made segregation of bus stations unconstitutional. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy were two of the many Freedom Riders that fought for the integrated interstate bus travel. Associated with Congress of Racial Equality, Freedom Riders were white protesters and African Americans. At southern bus terminals, Freedom Riders traveled by bus through Alabama and Mississippi to challenge segregation, facing extraordinary violence from bitter white Southerners as they journeyed to there. The Corps selected 13 people, which consisted of black and whites for the first ride.
The ride consisted of white riders sitting in the back of the bus and black riders in the front. Whenever there was any stops, blacks tried to use segregated facilities in the station. The riders were trained civil rights activists. The whole protest was non-violent. They were just doing what the Supreme Court had ruled was their right to do. The riders counted on local racists to respond violently. This would force the federal government to react. For instance, the extremely mad whites harassed and assaulted the bus riders in Birmingham, Anniston, Montgomery, Alabama, and Macomb, Mississippi.
From the brutal actions of the whites, the Freedom Rides opened a new light on the dilemmas of African Americans. In doing this, they forced that the federal government give them protection, and in their favor they sent more than 400 federal marshals to Montgomery just to protect the Freedom Riders. Freedom Riders were ready for the worst. They even left letters for their loved ones in case they did not survive.
Violence occurred for the first time in Rock Hill, South Carolina, with John Lewis, who was 21 years old, who was the future chairman for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and U.S. Congressman. Albert Bigelow was attacked along with John Lewis, where they were knocked unconscious by a white man.
On May 4th at Washington, D.C., the Freedom Riders took one of the most tragic rides all through Virginia and the Carolinas into Georgia and Alabama. The bus did not travel the whole way, though. It was met by an angry mob of 200 people in Alabama. They stoned the riders and slashed the bus's tire. However, the bus escaped and fixed their tire outside of the city. This did not stop the riot. The mob caught up with them and threw a firebomb inside. The riders hardly escaped before the bus burned into flames. The other bus reached Birmingham, but one rider was crippled for life. After this incident, violence against the Freedom Riders gained international coverage. This motivated Freedom Riders not to back down from their brutality.
Through the rest of the summer, hundreds of Freedom Riders traveled the Deep South in the effort to integrate bus travel. In September, the mass arrests and riots had their desired effect. The Interstate Commerce Commission set up guidelines governing the integration of all interstate bus terminals. The crisis atmosphere subsided once the focus of civil rights began to change to efforts to register African Americans to vote. However, many civil rights workers were known by local blacks as Freedom Riders. Like one stated, the courage and tenacity of those pioneers had captured the imagination and awe of blacks throughout the Southland.
The actions of the Freedom Riders did in the end influence long-lasting changes in federal law. To outlaw segregation on buses, trains, and at transportation terminals, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy petitioned the Interstate Commerce Commission. After this, the Justice Department did the same thing with ending segregation at airports. Congress passed civil rights legislation in 1964 and 1968, which outlawed segregation in many public facilities. By Nora Fakori
and Sandeep Bhatti,
aka Sonora.